Well, why don't we get started? Welcome and thank you for joining us from around the world at the midway point of the Glasgow Climate Change Conference, commonly known as COP26. I'm Lynn Wagner, and I lead the Earth Negotiations Bulletin project at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. The Earth Negotiations Bulletin has been delivering the authoritative record of sustainable development negotiations for almost 30 years. In March 2022, we will celebrate our 30th anniversary. Since our start in 1992, during the preparations for the Rio Earth Summit, the UN Conference on Environment and Development, our mission has been to increase transparency and accountability in international policymaking, ensuring that delegates, media, civil society groups, and others get a record of these critical negotiations. Our work is supported by a number of governments and organizations. For our coverage of the this COP, we give particular thanks to the Austrian Federal Ministry of Climate Action, Environment, Energy, Mobility, Innovation, and Technology, Environment and Climate Change Canada, the European Commission, the Government of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs. Our coverage and 30 years of archives for our reports on global environmental negotiations is freely available on our enb.iisd.org website. In addition to our coverage of negotiations on climate change, you will find reporting on efforts to address biodiversity loss, land degradation, chemicals management and trade, deep sea mining, the Sustainable Development Goals, and more. Or subscribe to get our emails when we upload new reports at bit.ly/ENB update. Please register, and please do share our reports and photos and videos with your colleagues. It is the greatest form of compliment when you introduce others to our resources. The Earth Negotiations Bulletin is a team within the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Our IISD colleagues are also in Glasgow, including teams that help countries build national adaptation plans and ramp down subsidies for fossil fuels. You can find more about IISD's work at iisd.org/ISD-COP-26. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. Our main presenter, Dr. Jennifer Allan, will present an overview of where the negotiations at COP26 stand as they head into the second week. Following this presentation, she will answer your questions. Please use the Q&A function to share your questions or to vote up questions that you're also interested in. If you have any comments, please share them in the chat. We'll do our best to keep the Q&A section lively and as informative as possible. And so with that, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jennifer Allan. She's been a team leader for ENB's climate change coverage since 2016 and has been with ENB since 2012. I'm looking forward to hearing her summary of last week and what to expect this week, and to find out what types of questions you have as we go forward. And so with that, Jennifer, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening, depending on where you're from. Welcome to Glasgow. We are very happy to have you here. What we're going to do is, or what I'm going to do, I guess, is give a quick overview of what we saw in week one. And I'm going to start with some of the broad issues. So if I'm seeing a lot of academics and I have a feeling you're going to have very specific, probably very smart questions for me, which I'll try, but be patient while I do some of the broad issues. And for those of you that are interested in the broad issues, I'll just ask your patience while I get into a little bit of nitty-gritty here and there. So I'm going to start with some of the big issues that we've seen, because really, to my mind at this point, we have a tale of two COPs happening. We have one side where it's the big leaders events, it's all these big level pledges that we're probably all seeing in the news. Then on the other side, we're seeing the negotiations. So it's sort of like a second COP or a COP within a COP maybe. And that's where a lot of the details are happening and where a lot of the key issues for climate action are being kind of fought over and debated. So I'll start with the big leader type issues, then I'll move into the negotiation focused issues. So this COP had over 120 heads of state, which is the most since Paris in 2015. And we saw them in the second and third day, so the Monday and the Tuesday, all of them getting up to give speeches. We also had various royalty. Sir David Attenborough was there. So it was one of these big high-level political moment type events. There were several declarations or several pledges made. We saw new financial pledges from countries like Spain, Japan, Denmark, Norway. The US had announced its contribution earlier in the year, as had the EU. And then we also saw new pledges coming forward, such as India's pledge to be net zero by 2070 and to move towards having 50% of its electricity from renewable energy sources by 2030, which is hugely ambitious. We also saw collective type announcements. So there was all those individual ones, and then we saw collective type of initiatives launched or declarations made. So two, maybe just to highlight quickly. One was the Glasgow Declaration on Forests and Land Use, which aims to end deforestation by 2030. 110 countries have signed on, representing all of the main forest basins and forest ecosystems around the world, particularly in the global south. So that was something that got a lot of attention, I think on Tuesday when that was launched. The other one maybe to highlight is the Global Methane Pledge. This was first launched in September at the Major Economies Forum on Environment and Climate by the US and the EU. And at Glasgow, it grew. So I think maybe by Monday, it was up to 70 countries. By Tuesday, they were saying 90. President Biden indicated maybe it was 100. So hopefully we'll see an actual list soon to see who's in there. And it's aiming to reduce methane emissions by 30% below 2020 levels. So basically 30% below current levels by 2030. So in the next 9 years. Again, hugely ambitious because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And reducing methane means that, a lot of countries called it the low-hanging fruit. It's sort of the easiest win, but it's also really necessary to address because a lot of our focus has been on CO2 until recently. So all of these, if we think about adding them together, there's been some very initial, almost kind of back of the envelope type calculations happening. And it's worth talking about those a little bit because some of them, for example, the IEA has said that all these pledges put together means that Glasgow's putting us on a trajectory for 1.8 degrees of global warming by 2100. That's huge because before this COP, we thought we were looking at about 2.7 degrees. So that's a massive chunk that's already happened. It seems like a huge jump in just a few days. So it's worth thinking about the caveats here and thinking about the numbers. So the IEA's calculation and a few others that have kind of come out in the last few days, it's worth realizing that that's all of the pledges put together. That's net zero, that's all the NDCs. Some of them are including private sector initiatives that were announced here. Now the net zero, those are long-term goals. So we're thinking their effect will be in the second half of the century because it's net zero by 2050, 2060, 2070. So we'll start to see the impact of that in the second half of the century. The NDCs are in the next 5 to 10 years. So the interesting thing to think about this in the models is that the net zero bit, that second half of the century bit, is doing a lot of the work in this modeling exercise. If we don't have NDCs that get us on a trajectory where we'll hit those net zero goals by 2050, 2060, 2070, then these models are going to fall apart pretty quickly because global warming is about the cumulative emissions. It's not just about what we emit in any given year. So that's one thing to think about, is we still need the NDCs to make sure they put us on track for net zero. The other main caveat, and it's sort of one of these big ifs that all of the assumptions, or that all these models are assuming, is that all of these pledges will be fully implemented on time. That's something that might be a big if. And so again, 1.8 sounds great, but there's a lot of caveats we should put around this. Similarly with the Forest Declaration, there have been other declarations in the past. You could think of the Aichi targets in the Convention for Biodiversity. You could think of the New York Declaration on Forests. They all aim to end or have deforestation by 2020, 2030, depending on what you're looking at. And yet deforestation continues and is rising. So it's still worth thinking, we need to do more work than maybe a declaration. So hopefully more details will come out. The other thing maybe just to quickly mention, and I'm not trying to really just throw a lot of cold water on this, but I think it's important to think about this event and the World Leaders Summit in context, is that a lot of the pledges, like the Global Methane Pledge, for example, are not being included in countries' NDCs, their pledges to the Paris Agreement they've been submitting. That's potentially a challenge because it means that countries won't necessarily have to report back on how they're doing. So countries under the Paris Agreement submit their pledges, their NDCs, and then on a regular basis, every couple of years, they submit a report saying, here's how we're doing. If some of these extra pledges that have happened outside of that architecture happen, if they're not brought in, then they won't be reporting on here's how we're doing under the Global Methane Pledge, for example. So it's difficult to see how some of these things will be followed up on, how countries could be held accountable. There might be calls in the second week to encourage countries to update their NDCs in light of pledges made in Glasgow, perhaps around forests, perhaps around methane. So that might be something to look at for the second week that could happen. There are a few countries saying, let's make sure we get some of this pledging and get some of these commitments back into the architecture of the Paris Agreement so that really we can hold countries to account, we can keep track of how well we're doing. So that is all the big level, high level, and I have to say, just personally, I was kind of happy to see the leaders leave. Like, it is kind of exciting when you see Prime Minister Modi walking down the hall with his security detail, but the venue was just mayhem in the space where the leaders were. It was difficult to get in. It was difficult to move about. Some observers were having trouble getting access to that space. And the security details, the entourages, it's not about one leader as one person. They all bring with them a whole entourage of people. So once the leaders left, all of a sudden there was space to walk. And in a way, I think there's also kind of space to breathe. The negotiators could kind of exhale and get back to work. And it became easier for observers to access the negotiation space, which is very important. So on to negotiations. This is a really full agenda, partly because of the pandemic. So COP was postponed last year, which means that a lot of the work that would have happened last year has to happen this year, in addition to some of the mandates that have come through from this year. And don't forget, in Madrid in 2019, countries actually didn't manage to agree on quite a few issues. So we also have the work from 2019. So on the agendas, you'll see things like report of the Adaptation Committee from 2019, 2020, and 2021. And so we're really seeing an enormous amount of work on these agendas. They're absolutely packed. So I'm going to highlight a few, and then if your favorite issue is not there, please let us know in the questions or upvote other ones related to it, and we'll get to it. So I'm going to highlight finance, adaptation, Article 6, loss and damage, common timeframes, And then quickly this overarching covering decision, which we're still kind of figuring out what that is. So finance, there's a lot of finance on these agendas, a lot of finance. And it runs the gamut of issues. So some of it is about the report that gives an overview of climate finance flows. For the very first time, there's a new report that assesses the needs of developing countries into what they'll need to adapt to climate change and to reduce their emissions. So it's the first time that report has been published ever or produced. And so parties are kind of figuring out what to do with that and how to follow up on that. There's also negotiations for a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. Have to get all the words in the right order. So they won't be deciding a number here. They're not going to say, after 2025, we agree to mobilize X millions or billions of dollars, or perhaps trillions. There's been calls for about 1.3 trillion. The goal in Glasgow is to set up a process by which they'll figure out what that number will be. So it's a bit procedural, but what we're seeing in the current draft text is it's 11 pages, so it's pretty long for setting up a process. And you can really see the split between developed and developing countries here. You can see that, developing countries really want to articulate a stringent process and get a lot of the issues that matter to them now on the agenda for that process. So that could include the assessment of developing country needs. That could include loss and damage finance. There's also calls for the UN process, the UNFCCC process, to start thinking about how to work with other providers of finance, like multilateral development banks, how to think about aligning private investment flows and to what extent we can leverage private investment and get it through the UN system or make climate finance more accessible. It's actually pretty hard to get climate finance for a lot of small island states and least developed countries. It can be a very technical process. So developing countries have a lot of issues that they would like to see in some of this process for the new goal. Developed countries are thinking about it more in terms of, let's leave it a bit more open, let's kind of hear all views, and then we'll start looking at what we could do by 2024. They're also thinking about it in terms of kind of lessons learned from the experience of trying to mobilize 100 billion by 2020, which they didn't quite manage to do. They published a roadmap that says that they expect to be able to hit 100 billion by 2023. There's been a few suggestions that maybe they might get there a year early, depending on whether or not Japan's contribution can also mobilize additional finance. But it's going to be one of those issues that comes down to the wire. And right now you can see that clear dividing line between developed and developing. And so it'll take all week, essentially. Some of the finance negotiators are saying they're going to have a very hectic week ahead trying to deal with all of this. Adaptation. So for the first time, the global goal on adaptation is on the agenda. And this was a bit of a long-standing call. So the African group especially has wanted to see the global goal on adaptation on the agenda for quite a while. They formally requested it in Madrid and it didn't go through. There were debates among parties about whether or not it should be considered on a regular basis. Now it is. And so they're still working out the mandate for that. And that'll be a lot of the work coming ahead into week 2. So the report on the Adaptation Committee, they didn't finish that last night when they concluded after midnight. So that will be taken forward to the next week. And the global goal on adaptation will also be discussed next week. So it'll be interesting to see what countries do with this, because developing countries want to see a much more robust kind of a much more robust way of making the global goal more operational. And developed countries are saying, let's start implementing. So it's, again, one of these sort of principal divides and sort of part of a long-standing, many years call to really get adaptation on par with mitigation. And the global goal on adaptation is a bit symbolic in that way. So moving it up and getting it on the agenda more prominently is kind of a win for a lot of developing countries. All right, Article 6. Now, I'm sure we're going to have people on this call that are absolute Article 6 experts. So apologies in advance if I mess something up. But I have to say, sitting in on Article 6 this last week, it doesn't matter developing countries, who I speak to, there's a lot of optimism in that room that it's going to be done at this COP. There's a lot of sort of, goodwill to an extent, but also kind of a sense that this is when they really have the clearest articulation of what the options on the table are and how some of those options might play off against one another. And they haven't had that for a long time. They've been producing multiple texts, rewriting the texts, and then they can't agree to a single one, so they forward them all to the future. And they've done that for multiple years in a row. So now they have a text that countries are comfortable with. They think it articulates the options quite clearly. They still want to do more technical work. They're not yet ready, it seems, to give it to ministers. But there are some issues that probably ministers are going to have to get involved with. They're sort of more political decisions. So just a few of those. Some of them, so especially this is the ITMOs, the Article 6.2, where countries can trade mitigation outcomes credits. One of the big things there is if there will be a share of the proceeds from that mechanism that will be given for adaptation. So small island states, least developed countries really want to see this, that we know that the other market mechanism, the 6.4 market mechanism, we know that it's already largely agreed that some percentage of the money of the activity within that mechanism will be given to the adaptation fund. They want to see the same thing for the 6.2 mechanism. So that's something that they're really pushing hard for. And it might be one of those red lines that they have to see. There's also, now bear with me if you're not an Article 6 person, corresponding adjustments. So in a nutshell, corresponding adjustments is when you have a country selling a credit and a country buying a credit. Both those countries are going to have pledges to the Paris Agreement to reduce their emissions, probably. So if the country selling the credit, they can't count it towards their pledge, towards their NDC, because they're selling it. So there has to be an adjustment between these two parties to make sure that their NDCs and their national reports are accurately reflecting who bought the credit, who sold the credit, and where those emission reductions will count. So that's the corresponding adjustment idea. It sounds fairly simple, like you could just do it in an Excel spreadsheet, but it gets complicated when you think about the various types of credits and activities that could happen under this mechanism. It might be increasing renewable energy. It might be forests. So how to measure and deal with different types of metrics, especially some countries really want to see non-greenhouse gas metrics like kilowatt hours used. So how do we transfer that into something that is similar, maybe a CO2 equivalent, but then could go to the buying country and count towards their pledge and their targets? That's where it gets really complicated. And the text kind of calls for a work program to continue working on this in the future. But this is one of those things where there's actually quite a few countries saying, let's solve it here and now in Glasgow. We might be able to revisit it later, but let's get something on the table now, because really you have to do that to build confidence that this mechanism can work. If you don't have that sort of accounting corresponding adjustment mechanism in place, countries aren't going to have the same confidence when they buy and sell credits, how they'll be able to count them towards their targets. So it's one of those issues that's very technical, but there's a lot of push to try and get it sorted here, rather than kind of kicking it down and addressing it next year. Where else? Gosh, so on the market mechanism, there's a lot of calls to include safeguards for human rights and indigenous peoples. because previous experience with carbon markets has shown that Indigenous peoples have been displaced, or that they've been, their human rights have been abused or violated because of the activity in carbon markets. So there is a push to try to include them in this mechanism. Also, there's a lot of calls about emissions removals because forested countries certainly want to be able to access this mechanism. And then the last bit of Article 6 is something called non-market-based approaches. So it's public finance, for example, would be one, or the provision of private finance. So some of the things we see in the pavilions where they're talking about all the great work they're doing, maybe that could be brought into the UN process through this mechanism. The big question there is how to govern it. Does it need a task force? Does it need a standing committee? Maybe is it a looser arrangement under a subsidiary body? All of these things sort of matter because it speaks to the profile that this mechanism will have moving forward. Okay, bear with me, 3 more. Loss and damage. They actually concluded most of their substantive work last night. So they really did quite a bit of pretty good work to, this word again, operationalize the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. And this network is a technical expert body, but it's really interesting because when you think about loss and damage, the permanent effects of climate change, it touches on so many other communities of practice in the global system. It could be humanitarian aid, it could be the disaster risk reduction community, agriculture and food security. All of these different parts of global governance kind of fall under this banner of loss and damage. And so this network is trying to figure out how to bring them together and how to make sure that countries have the right actors from this diverse community working in their country in a way that's relevant for what they need. Because what a sub-Saharan African country is going to need will be very different on the loss and damage front than a small island developing state. So this network is trying to kind of reconcile all these very kind of siloed off communities and bring them together in a very catalytic way. So they concluded that work. They're a bit next week, importantly, about who's governing this. Is it just under the Paris Agreement? Is it under the COP as a whole? Is it both? That's a decision that will have to be made maybe by ministers next week. But most loss and damage is done. It doesn't mean you're not going to hear about it next week a lot. So developing countries, especially small island states, least developed countries, they're putting loss and damage into a lot of other agenda items. So finance, certainly are related to adaptation and NDCs. So loss and damage is getting peppered throughout the negotiations. And I think especially on the finance front, there's going to be a lot of calls for loss and damage finance. Common timeframes very quickly. This is, in a way you can think about it about how long does an NDC last? 5 years, 10 years. Some countries are saying sort of a 5+5. So maybe they have different ways of explaining 5+5, but maybe you give your 5-year NDC and then you pledge the next 5 years. Maybe you give a 10-year one, but update it halfway through. And this one was interesting because very quickly, countries put through what their options were and said, okay, we're not going to work on this. We know this is a political decision. It's going straight to ministers next week. So they met maybe only twice last week because everybody knew ultimately this is going to be part of the final package that'll be hopefully decided this week. It doesn't have to be. They agreed they wouldn't actually make a decision on this for quite some time, maybe I think 2031. But there is a lot of push to get it solved here because it helps to know when countries are going to be updating so that they can work in concert, they can communicate, they can coordinate. It also matters for things like Article 6. If you're trading credits, but the buying country and the selling country, if they have different NDC cycles going, it's going to make it much more complicated to keep track of where those credits count for what emission reduction target. So there's implications throughout the Paris mechanisms for this common timeframes issue. The last one, because this is a bit of a surprise in Glasgow, is something called a covering decision. These don't come across that often. So you'll see it called like 1 CP25, for example. What that means is it's a decision that kind of wraps up the whole COP in one document. Usually this only happens when there's sort of a big mandate for the COP, like the Bali Action Plan or adopting the Paris Agreement, that kind of thing. So there isn't that same mandate here. And so a lot of countries are actually kind of surprised to see this because they don't know what the mandate is, sort of what's the reason for the being for this covering decision. But the presidency clearly wants it. It's something that they just put out sort of a list of bullet points about what could be in it. And it's an interesting list. There's adaptation finance is heavily figured. Then there's a mitigation section that has a bunch of bullet points. Some are pretty interesting, like an annual update on the effective pledges of NDCs, which, I mean, given that NDCs don't have to be submitted every year, I'm not sure about that one. Like, I think maybe that's code for they're trying to do something else with that, but it's an interesting idea. There's also loss and damage. There's finance, capacity building, technology transfer. So some items under that. There is implementation and then a collaboration section. And underneath each of them, I mean, having a quick look, there's things in there that various countries are going to hate. And there's things in there that various countries are going to like, maybe even love to see. The question is if that balance is right. And the trick is then turning bullet points into paragraphs that involve an awful lot more words that can trip up countries and frame issues that they might like to see in a way that they don't agree with. So those will be the big challenges. 1, getting countries on board that this should exist. 2, making sure that the balance of issues in it will be acceptable on the whole for all countries and that no absolute red lines are crossed. And 3, getting those bullet points, whatever they end up being, into paragraphs that countries can work with. In the past, countries haven't loved extra work like this. They're already very busy with all the agenda items. So these consultations have been sort of at the head of delegation level. And sometimes they really don't like having to devote some of those very important resources to an extra decision that they were maybe half anticipating. So it'll be really interesting to see how this shapes up over the next little while and to see what extent ministers start to get involved in this, because that might be a way to kind of work through these thorny issues a little bit more quickly. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully questions are already pouring in. So yeah, ask your questions in the Q&A. If you see a question you like, give it the little upvote. I'm also happy to speak for those of you that aren't on site, happy to speak about the COVID and the logistics, all the rules we have around that, because as you can see in the photos, we're all wearing masks and trying to be socially distant, which has mostly happened somewhat. So happy to speak about all of that if you like. So yes, thanks very much. And sorry, I know that was a very quick rundown of about 250 agenda items.
Thank you so much, Jen. And as she says, please do use the Q&A function, both to pose your questions and to vote up the ones that you want answered. We have a question. Has there been any prominence given to carbon budgets through negotiations? Doesn't the UNFCCC's latest report of assessment of NDCs suggest that we blow the 1.5 degrees Celsius budget by 2030?
Yeah, and that's what the IPCC is telling us. We have future IPCC reports coming up early next year. The interesting thing with this is that the words carbon budget don't appear in the UNFCCC sort of dictionary, because there's historic kind of, I guess I'll use the word tensions, but that almost feels like an understatement, about burden sharing, who should do what, who's taking up that carbon budget space and who should be reducing and who should be allowed to have more of that space. So because of those tensions, they don't use those words. Instead, they're using things like ambition, trying to ramp up the ambition in NDCs. And that's what sort of the push was here. Because we have the Paris Agreement. It actually started in 2020 in terms of work. Glasgow is about showing the Paris Agreement is a viable response to climate change. And that's what we're trying to do. So that's why we're seeing words like ambition happening instead of carbon budget.
Thanks. To what extent are the Sustainable Development Goals being articulated in the negotiations at COP26?
That's another, great question. And there's a weird relationship between the UNFCCC and the SDGs, because the SDGs were adopted just a few months before the Paris Agreement, maybe 2.5 months really. And the climate goal really reflects that there were ongoing negotiations for the Paris Agreement. And so you'll see references to the SDGs, but under all of these negotiating agendas, there won't necessarily be explicit recognition of this goes to SDG, life on land, for example. It's more of sort of a recognition that climate is a big part of achieving the SDGs. But I think there's a bit of a division of labor maybe happening, or a hesitance for climate to look like they're taking over the SDG agenda. So it's usually quite careful and maybe a bit more limited than we might expect in terms of how much people are talking about the SDGs in this climate space.
Thank you. Do you have any comments on non-state actor pledges like the GFANZ and net zero commitments?
GFANZ. I don't know what that one is. I'm going to go with NZ is net zero. The G might be global. So sorry if that was your question. I don't know what that is. So please let me know.
That is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero.
Mark Carney's thing. Yes. Okay. So this is an interesting part of COP. And when I said there's 2 COPs, maybe there's 3 COPs, because then there's the race to zero, race to resilience, all these non-state actor pledges. And they're another thing that doesn't directly plug into, say, NDCs or the formal architecture of the Paris Agreement. So there are some calculations that try to put them into the models. And the Energy Transition Council gave that a go this week. And they said, if you tally all of this up, the net zero pledges from countries, a lot of the private actor stuff we're seeing in various sectors, if we need to reduce emissions by, what did they say, 22 gigatons, that'll get us 9 gigatons of reductions. So still a long ways to go. I think people just aren't sure what to do with these, because again, there's no this very light touch follow-up. The Secretariat issues a yearbook of global climate action that tries to track. Antonio Gutierrez, the Secretary General of the UN, he just announced that there will be an expert group that will try to assess these pledges and make sure that they're legitimate and not greenwashing. Al Gore had an interesting statement saying we're entering an era of radical transparency. And he was pointing to things like satellites and artificial intelligence, for example, in terms of another way to make sure that companies and countries were following through. But yeah, it's really interesting to see the divide between what's happening in that non-state actor space and in the formal negotiations. They really aren't plugging into each other all that directly.
How can one, or how are they, separating loss and damage for Africa and small island developing states, as there are countries such as Comoros who are part of both groups, part of Africa and part of small island developing states?
Yeah, and you'll see with a lot of developing country coalitions, there's tons of overlap there, where you might also be an African small island state that's a least developed country. And so maybe part of 3 coalitions. So they aren't specifically separating it out and saying Africa gets this for loss and damage. It's more about trying to make it country driven for their specific types of needs. So what Comoros might need might be very different than other African states. And that's really what the Santiago Network is trying to get at. But loss and damage has been a slow burn, and it's been a tough slog to really get moving and get countries' collective heads around. So they're still trying to figure that out, but there isn't really the division between them. It's about trying to recognize it globally as another key part of climate action, one of those main pillars.
We have an attendee who would like to know more about pledges related to energy, such as the coal phase out. So anything perhaps that stood out to you on that day or throughout the COP?
Yeah, there's the Powering Past Coal Alliance that's been around for a few years. They're trying to ramp up. There were certainly welcome pledges for no longer pledging towards like overseas fossil fuel infrastructure, so building new coal plants. So China's, when did they make that pledge? Over the summer. So China's pledge to stop funding overseas coal is huge. They're a massive funder. So that will be, provided it's no new versus things already in the pipeline, that could be a game changer. But again, it's really interesting because the Paris Agreement only mentions one specific sector, and that's forests. The words fossil fuels do not appear in the Paris Agreement. So it's another thing where this sort of sectoral approach doesn't plug in a really obvious way to the infrastructure of the Paris Agreement. It shows up instead in NDCs, and it shows up in these extra sort of announcements. Denmark and Costa Rica are also launching the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which has been growing here at COP and getting additional people or countries signing on.
A question, what is your message, if you could speak to Greta Thunberg, to the protesters on the street, and perhaps especially to youth?
Keep going. I mean, I think it's something that, there was 150,000 people on the streets yesterday, tens of thousands on the streets the day before. And that doesn't go unnoticed in the negotiations. As much as negotiations are sort of a bubble and we don't actually clue in or realize what else is happening in the world, we know that those marches are happening. We hear the helicopters over the venue. And so it helps with the accountability part. Countries need to know that accountability and transparency isn't just providing a national report to the UN system, that it's at home to its own citizens. And the growing climate movement and the diversity of the climate movement, everything from environmentalists to youth to labor unions, indigenous peoples, all of that helps because countries know that when they go home, there's a mobilized movement that's going to hold them account to their Paris Agreement pledges. We need them to meet their targets, not just announce the targets. That's really where the climate movement can continue to push for more and to hold them accountable. We can't have countries, there's criticism this week that some countries were making pledges while at home they're also investing in new fossil fuels. So the production gap report, for example, tells us that there's a whole lot of new fossil fuel investment happening. That's the kind of thing that the movement can really help shine a spotlight on.
In the negotiating rooms, how has the new US administration played out?
It's interesting, right? The Paris Agreement comes and goes and then comes and goes. So they're back right now. And I think it sends a good signal that they're back. Some of their positions have moved a bit. Some of their positions, for example, on financing loss and damage, are still the same as they were before. And so it's interesting to see the extent to which there's still continuity and the extent to which there's change. I'd say they're certainly more constructive than they were on several issues, but there is still kind of a sense that in some ways the US is playing a bit of catch up. So at this COP, they just announced their first ever contribution to the Adaptation Fund. And they just announced their long-term low emissions development strategy, which many other countries have already put in. So there's a bit of catch-up happening here. And so the US is sort of in an awkward position of trying to be constructive, perhaps trying to be a leader, but also catching up on a lot of climate work that didn't happen over the preceding administration.
Why are the COP26 negotiations already being referred to as a failure? Where do you think that is coming from? And can we expect any breakthroughs during week 2?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a trick with COPs. How do you know what's a success? Is it a success that we have more countries on board for net zero than ever before? Some countries or some people might say yes. You know, that again, that 1.8 number is really relying heavily on those net zero pledges. Some people say, look, it doesn't get us to 1.5 and the NDCs don't get us to 1.5, so it's not a success. Some people that are looking maybe more narrowly at specific issues like funding for loss and damage or a higher profile and more funding for adaptation, they might say, okay, there's a partial win here. On the whole, it depends on where you want to put your benchmark for success. And I think those that are saying this COP has not put us on track for 1.5 degrees, that's the benchmark where so far we are falling short. And I don't know what could happen in the next week that will change that, because we have all the pledges in. We're not expecting any new pledges to be made. We're not expecting any new NDCs in the next week. What we're wrapping up now is the technical rule book issues. Those in the long term might help ratchet up ambition, and they're going to help implement NDCs, which is just as important or more important than making the pledge. But it's not going to improve that number necessarily of 1.5, which we haven't hit.
Would you be able to elaborate on the key disagreements right now on transparency?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, you notice how I didn't put transparency in there. Thank you, whoever asked that. I will quickly say, because I did see Simon on the call, Carbon Brief has an excellent red lines of different countries and coalitions across the agendas, and it's very, very well done. So I absolutely recommend that. Transparency is tough because one way to get agreement, because in this process, 197 countries have to agree to every word and every comma. And so one way to get them to agree is to use some pretty vague words. And that's what happened in Paris. So they agreed to a new transparency framework, so national reporting framework, that is applicable to everyone. So they all are going to do a common exercise in reporting. But there's flexibility for developing countries, especially least developed countries and small island developing states. So the trick now is, how do you make those words common with flexibility for different groups? How do you make them real in the context of providing a national report? And what they're working on right now is, again, there's this word I can never say, operationalize. Those kind of broad words, when you're looking at, literally it is a table that countries will fill in to do their national report. So does it mean that some information is optional? Does it mean that countries maybe can skip some questions? Does it mean that they can provide different types of indicators if that's difficult? So you're seeing developing countries, especially LDCs and SIDS, say, we don't have the capacity to do these really complicated reports. And to be honest, we don't emit enough to really have to do a huge inventory exercise in a common way as the US, for example, or a big developed country. So that's the dividing line right now, is striking that balance between the information we need to know in order to really assess how well we're doing and how well individual countries are doing, but allowing flexibilities where it's needed for capacity building or for capacity constraints. And so it's sort of what we're seeing happening here. There's a bit of a principled debate happening too, that was signaled in Madrid, even at the last COP, that developing countries, some are saying, like the African group, Well, this is a big issue for developed countries, but we have big issues too, like adaptation and loss and damage. We don't really want to keep moving forward on the developed countries' favorite issues until we see some parity with ours. And I don't know if that's going to come up next week again, but it might. That might be something that we see come like raised back from Madrid.
Can you give a brief update on what happened on Article 13?
13, global stocktake, right? Sorry,
I defer to your understanding of the agreement.
No, I don't have the numbers memorized. I think it's global stocktake. If I'm wrong, please tell me in the chat and I'll just fix it. So if it is global stocktake, which I think it might be, the question here is sources of input. Enhanced Transparency Frameworks 13. Oh, thank you, Joy. So that's what I was talking about with the reports that they're looking at. So they've made some progress on individual tables, one for reporting on NDC progress, how well you're doing towards your NDC, for national inventories, for, and actually a really tricky one is reporting on the support that a country has provided and reporting on the support, like financial support, for example, that a developing country has received. That's a really tricky table to do. And so they've made quite a bit of progress on them. That support one's a little bit thornier, partly for complicated reasons and partly for principled political reasons. So that's all next week. It's been packaged up. It'll be sent to next week, kind of like Article 6. The negotiators were saying yesterday, they want more time for technical work before they give it to ministers to really clarify the options that are available. Sorry, and thanks. I can't remember what global stocktake is, but now I know it's not 13.
Thank you. We are coming towards the end of the webinar. We will try and answer a few questions, but I wanted to draw your attention to a link I've just placed in the chat. Some colleagues are doing a survey on participation in side events online during COP26 as we all navigate online events. So if you have put on an online event or participated in online side events, please take a minute, click on that link and complete that survey after the webinar is concluded. In respect to Article 6, indeed on the $100 billion finance pledge, is it your view that more groundwork could have been done before COP26?
Yeah, so there was some groundwork. So it's been odd with the pandemic, right? So this is the first face-to-face meeting we've had. There were ministerial roundtables that were held on Article 6 over the summer, which is good because it means that ministers hopefully will show up with a good understanding of the issues, especially on this really technical one that's tough to get your head around. And then there was a ministerial process led by Canada and Germany to get developed countries together to try to figure out how or if they could mobilize that 100 billion by this COP. And they published a roadmap that says that no, they're not going to hit it by this COP, and they don't expect to hit 100 billion until 2023. And the way the reporting works, we may not know if they hit it in 2023 until about 2024 or 2025. So that published roadmap, the idea was to give some confidence that they're on it and they know they missed it. But it was sort of a piece of pre-COP work that tried to do a little bit more than what may have happened otherwise.
Can you please describe what was discussed at COP on climate-induced natural hazards and whether or not the use of nature-based solutions as mitigation measures for those hazards, how is that coming up during the COP?
Yeah, so loss and damage will include around the permanent effects of things like extreme weather events. Nature-based solutions is a big area, especially in the adaptation space. You're hearing that more outside the negotiations. So you're hearing that more in terms of some of the key actors on adaptation, like the NAP Global Network, but also, in that pavilion space, in the race to resilience space, they're really talking about nature-based solutions. So it's again this weird thing where the NDCs are the NDCs, and some countries will have that in and some won't. But that really thematic focus is happening a bit adjacent to the negotiations themselves.
How would you assess the level of trust between developed and developing country negotiators at this COP compared to other recent COPs?
Yeah, that's the crux of it at the end of the day, isn't it? At Madrid, it was all-time low. Like I said, Madrid left a lot of issues completely unresolved. They couldn't even agree to forward the work that they had on some issues, again, forward to this COP. I think it's a bit better in some areas. So I think it's better on the Article 6, for example. I think it's really low on finance. We're seeing some really strong words from some groups on the developing country side about developed countries' failure to come through on the 100 billion, but also the quality of the funds. So a lot of climate finance is loans, for example, and that actually increases the debt burden of countries. So they're saying, actually, we want more grants because grants are something we can use more quickly, and it is a provision of public finance that doesn't have to be repaid. So on finance, I think it is quite low. I think it's going to be very tricky for them to reach common ground on some of these issues.
I'm afraid that brings us to the end of our time, and thank you for a really lively discussion, both in the chat and in the questions. I've again dropped the link in the chat if you want to follow Dr. Jennifer Allan and the rest of the team from Glasgow for the rest of the week, and particularly looking towards the summary of COP26. But thank you so much for participating, and thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining us on your day off after what was a very long night, I gather.
Hey, I was happy they finished at 12:30 midnight. I had 3 a.m. in the pool.
Then we will wish everyone the very best day. We will be sharing a recording of this and look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thank you so much.